The global communist movement has learned a lot from the 20th century. And the main thing that happened is that the so-called left detached from the global communist movement. The synthetic left that was forged during the Cold War with CIA programs like the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Project MKUltra. When we talk about the synthetic left, we're talking about a process through which left-wing politics was completely reinvented. And I guess you could say that it's also been reinvented in the anti-imperialist countries and in the communist countries as well. The politics has been invented. Let's focus on how the Western left has been reinvented. Because at this point, I divide the synthetic left into three stages. Right? Communism, Marxism has historically been the movement of the proletariat, the working class, to seize control of the means of production, the banks, factories, and industries, and organize the economy for public good and not the profits of a wealthy few, to carry on production without the irrationality of the market so that wealth increases and the population overall becomes wealthier, that you don't have poverty amid plenty, you don't have poverty created by abundance. We often talk about the coal miner's riddle. The story goes, the coal miner, his son says to him, "Father, why is it so cold?" The father says, "Because we can't afford any coal to heat the stove." The boy says, "Why can't we afford any coal to heat the stove?" The father says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine. I was laid off." And the boy says to the father, "Why were you laid off from your job at the coal mine?" The father says, "Because there is too much coal." That's capitalism. Poverty created by abundance. The problem of overproduction, compounded by the problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit. That the more efficient production becomes, the easier it is to churn out goods, the more poverty that exists. An irrational system where the government buys thousands and thousands of pounds of cheese every day from farmers only to bury it in a cave in Missouri. And why do they do it? Why do they do it? Because if they didn't do that, the price of dairy products would sink so low, all the farms would go under. This is an irrational system. The capitalist system is irrational. And the socialist movement, historically, has been a movement of society overall, led by the working class, the wage workers, to seize control of the banks, factories, and industries so they can be operated for the benefit of all society, not simply a wealthy few who own them. It is the struggle of the working class and society as a whole to take control of the means of production so that growth can no longer be restrained, so that human innovation and human creativity can soar to astronomically new heights, no longer restrained by the irrationality of the market. Human reason and central planning can be put in control of the means of production. That's the communist movement, historically. And the communist movement first seized power in Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And under Stalin's leadership, Russia soared. It became the huge industrial superpower. Huge, power plants were created, huge steel mills, illiteracy was wiped out, millions of people were lifted from poverty. It became an industrial powerhouse. The Nazis invaded, they defeated the Nazis, and after they defeated the Nazis, pretty soon they were launching Sputnik, and they were inventing space travel. They patented the first cellular phone. This very, very backward, impoverished country with socialist central planning was able to lift itself up. After the Second World War, you had the Cold War. And it was during the Cold War that the American intelligence agencies, the CIA, was disturbed by the fact that so many scientists, so many intellectuals, so many writers, so many great thinkers and musicians and composers supported the Soviet Union, supported communism. You had at the Waldorf Hotel in 1949, a huge conference, the Waldorf Peace Conference. Albert Einstein was there. Aaron Copland, the musician, he was there. The composer was there. Shostakovich, the great Soviet composer, he was there. You had Robert Oppenheimer, one of the main creators of the atomic bomb, the scientist. He was there. Many brilliant intellectuals, Lillian Hellman, Will Geer, many actors, many people at the height of McCarthyism went to this pro-Soviet conference to basically say the Soviet Union was right and the U.S. was wrong in the Cold War. Paul Robeson was there. It was a big moment. And people looked on and they said, how is this possible? And so from there, the CIA began what they called the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, which was when they started funneling money to left-wing writers and intellectuals, artists, musicians, others, who were anti-communist. And they started a magazine called Partisan Review Magazine, funded by the CIA. And it was a new socialist magazine funded by the American government, sent to all the college campuses in America. Everybody was reading Partisan Review. And it was to try and create a new kind of socialism, leftism, Marxism. And it was all paid for by the American government. In Britain, they set up a magazine called Encounter. Same thing. In Germany, they started a magazine called Der Monat. In France, they started the Paris Review. And no one knew that this was American government propaganda. People thought this was just leftist viewpoints. But it was claiming to speak in the name of socialism, peace activism, civil rights, but it was paid for by the American government. You can Google this. This is now a well-documented historical fact, the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And they put forward a number of different intellectuals to be the voice of their new movement, most of whom were Trotskyites. Most of them were people who had worked with Leon Trotsky and had a falling out with Leon Trotsky, had been aligned with Max Shachtman and the Shachtmanites. They were neo-Trotskyites, broken with Trotsky over the question of the Soviet Union, of defense of the USSR. But their politics started taking an interesting turn. Hannah Arendt is one of the writers who was promoted by the CIA in the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And Hannah Arendt, she wrote a very famous book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And it was all about how Adolf Eichmann, this Nazi war criminal who'd been extradited, the Israelis had kidnapped him from Argentina. They took him to Israel and they hung him, about how he was just an ordinary man. Just an ordinary man, Adolf Eichmann, this Nazi war criminal. And the message of her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a study in the banality of evil, her message was that deep down, ordinary people are evil. Deep down, ordinary people are Nazis. And that you need sophisticated intellectuals to control the ordinary people, because if you don't, they're Nazis. And Hannah Arendt very famously equated Nazi Germany with the Soviet Union. And she said they were the same system, essentially. They were the same system. They were totalitarianism. Then you had Susan Sontag. And her argument, she went as far as saying communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. And communism is a variant of fascism. It's just fascism with a human face. You had Irving Howe, who went on to start something called the Democratic Socialists of America, Bernie Sanders' group. And Irving Howe said that if you're a socialist, you have to be a partisan of the West in the Cold War. You have to be on the side of the United States against the Soviet Union, against China. You have to be a partisan of the West in the Cold War. At the same time that the CIA was funding this new left, and they started calling it the new left, and all of a sudden these people were on TV saying that they were the left, right? They wouldn't allow genuine communists to go on TV, but all of a sudden these people would be on television, they'd be on the radio, they were the voice of the left. these people. At the same time, the CIA launched Project MK Ultra. They had the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Then they had MK Ultra. And what was Project MK Ultra? It was a program distributing hallucinogenic drugs to the public. Again, documented fact. Go read Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Go read The Poisoner in Chief. This is all public. They were distributing LSD all over the country. They were going to college campuses and paying college students to take LSD to see what the effects were. They had Operation Midnight Climax, where they walked around San Francisco and had undercover CIA agents just hand out LSD to random people on the street, drop it in people's drinks to see if that could have some military value. Getting people stoned out of their minds. They had open air concerts, rock concerts, where they would just hand out LSD to people. There'd be a free concert by the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or the whoever, and there would be drugs being handed out for free, getting all kinds of young people on LSD. And Dr. Timothy Leary, a college professor from Harvard, was involved in these experiments. He ended up getting fired from Harvard, and then he started touring the country as the high priest of LSD, going around the country urging young people to use LSD, to use drugs, to use hallucinogens. Tune in, turn on, drop out. All of this, we now know the reinvention of left-wing politics to be anti-populist, to see the people as the enemy, to promote things that communists have always opposed. Communists have been the biggest opponents of drug use. It used to be communists didn't even drink. John Reed, one of the founders of the Communist Party, he did not drink alcohol. Eugene Debs and many of the early American socialists and communists were against drinking alcohol. Marijuana, LSD, forget it. Socialists always were advocates of temperance. They argued that alcoholism and drug addiction, all of this was a tool of the capitalists to control people. It destroys people. It's a symptom of an evil system that people have to numb their pain with this kind of suffering. They saw what horrendous things. A lot of feminists were advocates of opposing alcohol because they associated alcohol with domestic violence. Right? I believe it was Carrie Nation, was a very famous feminist in American history who was also a big prohibitionist and was urging people not to drink alcohol. And there was a whole widespread movement for socialism in the United States, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party. And if you read what William Z. Foster wrote and others, they were not advocates of drug use. They were not advocates of dope. They were not advocates of people becoming intoxicated. And in fact, in China, after the revolution, one of the first things they did was they executed the opium importers and they stamped out the drug trade. The Black Panthers used to go assassinate heroin dealers because they saw heroin as a plot by the white man to kill the black community, and they would assassinate heroin dealers. So suddenly, though, leftism became associated with using drugs. And in the 1960s, because McCarthyism had not worked, McCarthyism was the first attempt to wipe out communist and leftist influence. Didn't completely work. The second attempt was to create a synthetic left, a place that people that had rebellious instincts, people that didn't want to follow rules, people that wanted to rebel against authority, people who might become communists might go. They went to this synthetic left. That was the first stage of what we're seeing now. The second stage came later. And it started really, the very beginnings of it were with what you called the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia in 1968, the United States was trying to divide Czechoslovakia from the Soviet Union. It was a Soviet-aligned government, a communist Marxist-Leninist government, Czechoslovakia. And they knew that among some of the young intellectuals in Czechoslovakia, there was frustration. They wanted more freedom of speech. They wanted, to be able to listen to Western music. They were enamored with the Beatles and rock and roll music and such. And so the CIA began promoting a faction in the Czechoslovakian communist government led by a guy named Dubček. And Dubček said he was a communist, but he said he was against Stalinism. He said he believed in socialism with a human face. That's what he said he believed in. He said he was not an anti-communist, but he was against Stalinism, and he wanted socialism with a human face, or democratic socialism. He was against the Soviet Union. We now know the CIA was funneling loads of money, funneling loads of leaflets and propaganda, doing everything it could to prop up Dubček's wing of the Czechoslovakian communists. But it looked like it was just a difference of opinion. The Soviet Union, they have their way of doing things, their, Stalinist way of doing things. And then in Czechoslovakia, they've got their more open socialism with a human face. And Dubček and his supporters seized control of the government of Czechoslovakia. They cut off support for the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. And they seized control of the government of Czechoslovakia, and they were moving Czechoslovakia to align with the United States against the Soviet Union. In the name, not of capitalism, but of democratic socialism. And so the Soviet Union intervened militarily, and it sent troops to Czechoslovakia to retake control of the country. But what the CIA learned was that it was much more effective to stage uprisings against communist governments, not in the name of anti-communism, but in the name of socialism with a human face, democratic socialism, human rights. Now, it started with the Prague Spring. Was that this synthetic left that had started as a way to kind of confuse communists and leftists in the Western countries started becoming a vehicle for staging protests and rebellions within communist countries. They realized that a lot of the young people who couldn't remember what it was like before the communists came to power, they were born after World War II. They couldn't remember what it had been like before the country had electricity, before the country had running water. They couldn't remember that. They'd grown up with a guaranteed job, with guaranteed health care. And they were frustrated with the fact that living in these communist countries, they didn't have the same freedoms that people have in other societies. They were frustrated with that. And they also really liked the rock and roll music. They liked Western American movies. The USA always had much sexier media than the Eastern Bloc communist countries did. So they liked this stuff, and those folks could be manipulated. And you started with Prague Spring, Czechoslovakia, 1968. But after that, all across the communist bloc, they started cultivating these intellectuals, these dissidents, most of whom did not believe they were anti-communists, most of whom believed that they were Trotskyists, anarchists, democratic socialists. But in reality, they were being used by the American government. And all of that culminated in the overthrow of the Eastern Bloc. In 1989, country after country was overthrown. East Germany, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, communist government after communist government was toppled. Toppled. What would happen is these young people would go out and protest, and there would be instability in the country. They'd be blocking roads. They'd be demonstrating. And it wouldn't be clear what they were protesting about. They would just say they wanted freedom. They would just say they wanted liberty. It wouldn't be clear what they wanted. And then a wing of the military would seize power and declare communism was over. It would use the chaos created by these young people. And that the CIA had also cultivated relationships. The American government had cultivated relationships with many of the reformist factions within the military and the policing agencies of the Eastern Bloc. And so they'd have all the young people go out and protest about, they didn't really know. They just wanted freedom. They're against corruption. They're for democracy. Wasn't clear what they wanted. And then the pro-US wing of the military would seize power and declare communism over. And this was the color revolutions. And it was the synthetic left. That was stage 2 of the synthetic left. Synthetic left started out in Western countries, but then it became useful in destabilizing communist governments. And many of these younger people were convinced, everybody pretty much, at the time that these counter-revolutions happened. Ultimately, you had the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991. These people were convinced, well, we're gonna become a social democratic country. We're gonna become Norway. We're gonna become Sweden. We're gonna become Finland. We're gonna have guaranteed jobs. We're gonna have guaranteed health care, but we won't have sanctions. We'll be able to listen to Beatles music. We'll be able to watch MTV. They didn't understand what they were getting, because in all of these countries, what they got was economic demolition. The countries were destroyed economically. The life expectancy would drop. Mass unemployment would follow. All the state industries that these countries had built up would be sold off to the highest bidder. And in the 1990s, you want to read about it, go read Europe Since 1989 by Philip Thayer. This book describes how country after country, Ukraine, Moldova, Czechoslovakia, Poland, was just economically devastated. Jeffrey Sachs and the International Monetary Fund would go to these countries and loot them economically. These countries were looted. Russia was looted. The Yeltsin years in Russia were a nightmare. Go and read Naomi Klein and her great book on this, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. When these countries toppled their Marxist-Leninist government in the name of democratic socialism, in the name of human rights, socialism with a human face, when the synthetic left came to power in these countries, they handed it over to Wall Street. And under Bill Clinton's leadership, the Yeltsin administration in Russia, the various Marxist governments, they wrecked these countries economically. And these people, and you can read many times people saying things like, we didn't know what we had. And in fact, polls show in every former Soviet country, every single former Eastern Bloc country, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Estonia, Moldova, even Ukraine, country after country, Yugoslavia, people say life was better before the fall of the Soviet Union. In fact, Soviet nostalgia is very widespread. People say we didn't know what we had. We didn't know what we had. We had guaranteed jobs. We had guaranteed health care, guaranteed education. We didn't have narco drug gangs. We didn't have human trafficking. We didn't have, organized crime. We could walk the streets safe at night. They didn't know what they had, and they'd been lied to. And it wouldn't have worked if they had done it in the name of anti-communism. If they'd attacked these people and said, oh, we're for capitalism, these people would have rallied to the defense of their countries. It was done. It was successful because it was done with the intellectuals, and it was done in the name of the synthetic left. It was done in the name of sexual freedom. It was done in the name of rock and roll music. It was done in the name of freedom of mind and democratic socialism and all of this. The synthetic left, that was stage 2 of it, was creating this apparatus of well-funded protest entities. George Soros was a Hungarian billionaire, not from the United States, but he would funnel the money to these countries, and he would manipulate the currencies, and that's how he made billions and billions of dollars. And this, and I'll never forget when I was in high school, my parents, wanted me to go away for the summer or whatever. So I went to a program to study peace studies, right? My parents are like, hey, you're activist-y or whatever, why don't you go study peace studies? So I went to this Quaker peace studies program. And it was part of this. And I remember, I didn't know at the time, but they showed us a movie called Bringing Down a Dictator, all about how they built this peaceful movement to overthrow Milosevic, Otpor. We talked about the Eastern Bloc and the negotiations that brought down the Soviet Union and how you can win without war. And it was all about how, the Pentagon and the war hawks, they're no good. But, what we need is we need people's consciousness awakening, speaking truth to power. And this peace studies program. And I remember I was a high school student and I sat through all the trainings and we did all these workshops about all of this. And we learned all about the color revolution apparatus, the people who protest in Venezuela nowadays, the people who protest in Nicaragua. It is a global network that they've created of NGOs and nonprofits. The Peace Corps is heavily involved with it, and it is a very sinister, and it looks very revolutionary and left-wing on the surface. They use the fist. They talk about human rights and workers' rights and women's empowerment, and it's this whole apparatus they created in the late Cold War in the 1970s and 80s, and really escalating in the 90s. And they can use it to bring down governments. And it was these entities that set the stage for the Syrian civil war, destabilized Syria, and reduced Syria to civil war. It's these entities that destabilized Libya, the most prosperous country on the African continent. Libya had the highest life expectancy. It was a very prosperous country under the leadership of Gaddafi. Now Libya is devastated. Since the revolution won in Libya, the country has been destroyed. The color revolution apparatus, that was the second stage of the synthetic left. This woke, activisty, human rights, anti-racist, women's empowerment, LGBT, sexual freedom, democracy movement that they set up, that they've then used to bring down any government that gets in the way of what Wall Street wants. And they use the college professors and academics. They're a big part of it. I remember when I was in college, a couple of the professors were just amazing shills for all of this. They would just, it was like whatever country the memo went out, we're supposed to hate this week. They'd be lighting candles for the monks of Myanmar. They'd be protesting to save Darfur. They'd be out there cheering for the Dalai Lama, whatever the cause of the week was, whatever, hating Russia and China and hating whatever government aligned with them we were supposed to be trying to overthrow. And that's what a lot of these academics are involved. That's what they do, right? They're tied in with this network, this pro-imperialist color revolution network that's been set up. And that when it's time to topple some government, that's what they do. And that was phase 2. But we're now living under stage 3 of the synthetic left. Stage 3 of the synthetic left is the color revolution apparatus coming home. Starting with the presidency of Barack Obama, in the aftermath of the U.S. financial crisis. Remember, the U.S. economy crashed and Barack Obama came in on a white horse to save us all. And suddenly the liberals had this upper hand with this new thing called Facebook, and then this new thing called Twitter. And all of a sudden, the color revolution came home. The color revolution apparatus came home. All these liberal foundations and NGOs, all of the use of social media to destabilize countries with protests, it all started happening here in the United States. As U.S. society becomes less and less stable, the ultra monopolies aligned with Silicon Valley, aligned with the big 4 super major oil companies, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, that faction, the ultra rich, the ultra monopolies that are tied in with the government, that are liberals, that are Democrats, They have come home to set up a low-wage police state. And the way they're doing it is with these mind control, emotional manipulation methods that were first learned with the synthetic left in the 60s and the counterculture, then learned in the Cold War, overthrowing various Marxist governments. And now with social media, they're amped up like you wouldn't believe. And they've ultimately found a method for controlling the United States. And they are very open about what they want. What do they want? They want to reduce the population. There's too many people. Number two, what do they want? They want to reduce consumption. They want all the people who do exist to have less, to have lower incomes, to buy fewer products, to live in worse conditions, to consume less. They want to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we use, the amount of electricity we use. They want to reduce the number of people overall, and they want to reduce the living standards of those people, of the people who do exist. What else do they want? They want a full-on mobilization for World War III. They want to tear down Russia. They want regime change in Russia. They talk about decolonizing Russia, even though Russia has never colonized anyone. They want to break Russia up into a bunch of pieces. They want to break China up into a bunch of pieces. They want to tear down all the socialist governments of South and Central America. They want to tear down the Islamic Republic of Iran. They want to tear down the Syrian Arab Republic. They know what they're doing. The color revolution apparatus has now come home to the United States. And the target is the United States, which they can lock down into a low-wage police state. And they can use social media to manipulate people, confuse people. And when it really gets down to it, they have one psychological trick. They have one psychological trick to carry out their operation. Libidinal release. They give you permission to unleash your impulses. We all have anger. We all have rage. We've all been mistreated in our lives, some of us more than others. We've all suffered unfairly. The way they gain their power is they go to people and they say, you have permission to be angry. They give you permission to unleash your rage. Number two, we all have a sex drive, don't we? I certainly do. We all have a sex drive. And they give you permission to unleash your sex drive. Unleash your sex drive. Unleash your rage. All the restraint that you've held in, let it out. By giving you permission to be angry, giving you permission to be sexual. Libidinal release is a way of winning your loyalty. Because generally, people feel guilty. People act out of control when they're angry. If people act out of control in a sexual way, they feel guilty. They come along. What do they say? They say, oh, you're right to be angry. If someone tells you not to be angry, they're tone policing you. They're tone policing you. Be angry. Be angry. They say, oh, you want to be sexual? Be sexual. Don't feel any guilt about it. And that basically they have created a situation where people are letting their rage go, where people are letting their sex go, where people are fighting each other over everything, where people are more alienated from each other than ever before, where Families are coming apart. Communities are coming apart. Where people are so much just broken down into atomized individuals on social media. Where it's hard to find common points of reference even in conversations. Where people are just resentful and angry and afraid and over-sexualized. And they break us all down into atomized individuals. That is what they are doing. And they're doing it so they can rule over all of us. There's an old, it's like one of the most common cliche stories, right? But, you get a bunch of sticks, right? You take a stick by itself. You say, break it. It breaks very easily. But then you get a bunch of sticks together in a bundle, and they say, now break it. And you can't. It's far easier to break an isolated individual than it is to break a solid community. And they know that. And so they are breaking us all. They're atomizing us all into isolated individuals, breaking up any community that exists, making everyone suspicious of everyone, making everyone afraid of everyone so that they can gain and maintain their power. And ultimately, what they are doing is they're trying to save capitalism. Because capitalism has this problem of poverty created by abundance, overproduction. The more wealth that's created under capitalism, the poorer people get. And we're in a long-term economic crisis because of the computer revolution, because of artificial intelligence. So much of this, we're in a long-term economic crisis. And so they are using the synthetic left, this left that they created to fight communism. They are using that as the mechanism for trying to force their degrowth on society. But there is resistance. And the resistance is very interesting. The resistance is very interesting because it used to be there were a lot of different ideologies out there, and there still are a lot of different ideologies out there, but they were all against each other. Christians and communists couldn't stand each other. And, Muslims and socialists and Arab socialists, they couldn't stand each other. And, Russian nationalists and communists, that all these ideologies that existed, all these belief systems that people built their countries and communities around, nationalism, religion, Marxism, socialism, all of these things were at odds with each other. But now, I've seen the resistance. When I went to Iran for the first time in 2014, that was my first time in an anti-imperialist country. I went to Iran in 2014, and I went to a conference. And at that conference, I was there as a communist. I was a member of the Workers' World Party, and I was sitting at the table with Shia Muslims, who are our hosts, with Russian nationalists. Russian nationalists, people associated with Alexander Dugin and with Putin supporters. I was sitting at the table with Ba'athist Arab socialists from Syria, former supporters of Saddam Hussein, Ba'athist Arab socialists. I was sitting at the table with Bolivarians from Latin America. We were in this one hotel, people from all over the world, the New Horizon Conference of Independent Thinkers and Filmmakers, all different ideologies against their system. And I'd say everyone in the room was more or less against capitalism. I'd say everyone in the room probably was critical of the official story of 9/11. But aside from that, there were big differences. People that would call themselves right-wing, people that would call themselves left-wing, black nationalists, libertarian conservatives from the United States. I guess they wouldn't be against capitalism. And all of us were there because we were at odds with this satanic liberal order that says not only is there no God, and they push that really, really hard now. There is no God, but there's also no right and wrong. There's no truth. There's nothing worth sacrificing for, nothing to believe in. And I'm sitting in a room full of people who reject that. And they say that right and wrong do exist, truth does exist, and the instability and the chaos that is being spread by the Pentagon and by Silicon Valley and by Wall Street around the world that leaves people in poverty, that destroys countries, that's created a refugee crisis. It's the enemy. And you can see that if you're a Muslim, and you can see that if you're a Christian, and you can see that if you're a Russian nationalist, and you can see that if you're a Baathist Arab socialist, and you can see that if you're a Bolivarian socialist from Latin America. You can see that if you're an old school communist, Marxist, Leninist. And when I go to conferences in Russia, and I went to the Yalta Economic Forum, when I went to the World Conference of Parliamentarianism or the Anti-Globalization Conference in Moscow in 2018, that's where I met Alexander Dugin. When I go to Nicaragua, when I went to Venezuela and saw a whole radio station paid for by Iran that they set up in Venezuela, that's what I'm seeing. Illiberalism. Illiberalism is coming together. And the fight is no longer, it's not these ideologies fighting each other. It's not about, are you a communist? Are you a Christian? Are you a Muslim? Are you a nationalist? It's not about that anymore. It's, are you a believer in growth and humanity and human productivity? Are you a believer in community? Or are you a believer in this satanic evil that has come over the world, that is promoted by the West now? The United States is dominated by the synthetic left. It's dominated by this sinister, pessimistic, Malthusian ideology that says growth and economic growth is bad. Human beings are a cancer on Mother Earth. All ideologies are a scam. All ideologies are false. There is no right and wrong. That is what the Western world is dominated by. And this is what they're spreading around the world. This is what they're fighting for in Ukraine. And this is what they brought to Libya after they overthrew Gaddafi. This is what they brought to Iraq after they overthrew Saddam Hussein. It is the sinister, pessimistic, hopeless belief in human beings as animals that need to be managed and manipulated with social media. That is what they're spreading all over the world. And it's evil. It's evil. And everyone who is imbued with any sense of morality, any sense of community loyalty, can see that. In fact, a lot of Americans can see that. Whether you want to hear me say this or not, a lot of Americans voted for Donald Trump because they can see that. As bad as Trump was in a lot of ways, Trump said, I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to make you love your country again. You know, check out Trump's latest speech about the quantum leap. He's going to build freedom cities. He's going to build new cities. He's going to encourage families to have children. Donald Trump increasingly appeals to people on the basis of being opposed to this evil. There is a global movement. There is a global movement rejecting Western liberalism, rejecting capitalism in decay and the neoliberal world order. and arguing that we need a society where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not the profits of a few. We need an economy that's for the people. We need humans to come together and work together. We need to value people. We need to view people as an asset. Every child, when they're born, should be viewed as capable of making a great contribution. We should invest in every child that's born. We should provide them with health care and education, not as a handout, but because their productivity as a human will contribute to our society overall. We should view every human being not as a freeloader, not as a burden, but as a potential beautiful flower in our garden. That's how we should view humanity. These are the values that can bring people together across ideologies. And these are the values that define the global anti-imperialist movement led by Russia and China. Iran is a big part of it. Venezuela is a big part of it. Nicaragua is a big part of it. This is the fight that's breaking out. It is between liberal fascism, wokeism, and the synthetic left that's taken control in the West, and humanity and God. However you want to speak of God, I'm sure, there's many atheistic communists who'd say, well, it's not God, it's simply the working class. It's the working class, the neo-colonial. Okay, fine. Don't call it God if you don't want to. But there is something more powerful than the evil that is unfolding before us. There is something that connects human beings to each other, that gives us the strength to push back against all of this. There's something that I've been to communes in central Caracas. I've been to neighborhoods in Tehran and in Isfahan where people are huge supporters of the Islamic Republic, and there is spiritual power. There's spiritual power. There is spiritual power. There is something that binds people together to say we are a solid block. We will not be moved. Just like a tree that's planted by the water, we will not be moved. We are going to stand here and defend our homes and our neighborhoods and our communities with our bodies. It exists. And it is that will be victorious. And it is that force that we at the Center for Political Innovation are desperately trying to tap into. We are trying to build a community of resistance and a community of solidarity. And we would like to have you become part of it. And we are going to continue to do everything we can with these broadcasts, with our documentaries, with our films, with our relationships with great thinkers like Scott Ritter and great people like Nick Brana from the People's Party. We are going to do everything we can to advance the human race in the face of this evil and to get us beyond the crisis of Western capitalism and imperialism and decay. And that is our worldview.